I'm Mac Malden, and I live in the Shoals area, and a group of private citizens and elected officials and business leaders got together and went to see PARCA's report on Birmingham. And we realized that we needed to do something like that in the Shoals. And so we hired PARCA to come in and do a study of our community, and we called it A Greater Shoals, A Pathway. We learned a lot about our community. PARCA did an outstanding job of understanding our community and looking at ways that we can partner within our 2 counties and 4 major cities. We're very proud of the work PARCA has done for us, and we are working really hard to implement a lot of the things that they suggested. PARCA measures what matters, has done a great job in Alabama, and I'm a proud member of that board. I'm a financial contributor, and we welcome you to be a part of our organization as well.
Good morning. I'm Ryan Hankins, Executive Director of PARCA, the Public Affairs Research Council of Alabama, and welcome to Day 2 of the 2021 PARCA Annual Forum, Alabama Online. On behalf of the Board of Directors, staff, investors, and supporters, thank you for joining us this morning. For many of you, this is your first time joining us. For all of us, this is a new way to have this conversation, virtual and over a number of days, and by using the Whova app, which I believe most of you are accessing today. That app and that website allow you to engage with each other, to ask questions, to post comments, to connect with speakers, and to see documents and presentations that will be shared throughout the week. So we hope you take advantage of that this week. You'll notice the questions and answers component to the side of your screen. You also may notice that the video is somewhat small, so you're welcome to maximize your video screen. You won't see all the Q&A, but the video will take up more of your screen than you may already see presently. I want to thank our sponsors whose support have allowed us to make this event free for everyone. You'll see sponsors on our event webpage and several spaces around the Whova app. And today I want to especially thank the A+ Education Partnership and Landscape Workshop. Thank you for your investment in PARCA and our work to measure what matters. Our goal this week is not to cover every angle, to hear every voice, or to explore every initiative, project, and plan. Rather, our goal is that we all gain more insight into the obstacles, opportunities, and complexities of broadband in Alabama, and securing full access, full inclusion, and full adoption to accomplish the goals and the promises of broadband. Second, we want to understand what full adoption, full access, full subscription could mean for Alabama and for all areas of our public and private life. And finally, we want to explore avenues that help us get there. Yesterday, we began by outlining the broad contours of the conversation, including what we mean by terms like even broadband and by digital access, digital equity, subscription. Today, we get a little more technical, exploring obstacles to broadband expansion and some industry and government efforts that are seeking to overcome these challenges. Our host for the morning is PARCA board member Larkin Martin, managing agent of Martin Farm in Courtland, Alabama. Thank you for joining us, Larkin.
Thank you, Ryan. I echo Ryan in thanking you for joining us in this important conversation. I'm proud to be a PARCA board member and an investor, and appreciate PARCA's role in convening important and difficult conversations. As Ryan mentioned, I'm a board member, but I'm joining you from Courtland, Alabama. Courtland is, and I'm a farmer. Our farm in Courtland is between Decatur and Muscle Shoals. It's a relatively rural area in a developing area of the state, but we, like so many other parts of the state, struggle for broadband access. And farming, I want to add it to the list of medical clinics and schools and businesses of all sizes that have realized broadband is essential to continuing our existence. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. And today, my brief visit with you is really just to turn it over to the speakers. So I want to introduce you briefly. We're joined this morning by Jordan Crenshaw, the Executive Director of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Technology Engagement Center.
Good afternoon, thank you.
All right, Fred Johnson, the CEO of Farmers Telecommunications Cooperative, will be with us.
Good morning, and thank you, Larkin. Good to be here.
And Maureen Neighbors, the Energy Division Chief of the Alabama Department of Economic and Community Affairs.
Good morning.
We look forward to hearing from all three of you all. You know, I had a chance to participate yesterday, enjoyed it very much, or listened yesterday. And as I'm beginning to understand this issue, we've really got two interrelated challenges. We've got the opportunity, we've got the challenge of making broadband technically available for everyone. And then we've got interrelated challenges of empowering the usage of that technology for everyone. So there's the get it to all the places that need it, and then help all the places that need it take advantage of it. And we look forward to the wisdom from our speakers today. I'm going to turn it back over to Ryan to moderate the session.
Thank you, Larkin, and thank you all, Fred, Maureen, Jordan, for joining us today. You may note that our agenda expects you to see Kim Lewis moderating. I am not Kim Lewis. Kim had a family issue emerge this morning, so I am pinch hitting for her. We wish the best for her and her family, and we'll miss her expertise on this subject. So thank you all. And let me begin by just asking Fred, tell us a little bit about the work in your community and kind of set the stage for us about what we're actually talking about today.
Thank you, Ryan. And let me thank you for giving me the opportunity to be with this group today. That is a distinct privilege, and I am grateful for it. Anytime that we can add to the constructive dialogue about the importance of broadband, that's a very productive day in my book. I have the distinct privilege of leading the Farmers Telecommunications Cooperative and its subsidiaries here in Northeast Alabama. We're a 69-year-old member-owned cooperative that has long led the state of Alabama in telecommunications and broadband technology. We were the first to deploy digital switching back in the late 70s and early 80s. We're the first gig provider in Alabama based upon an active Ethernet platform. And over the last 14 years, we are just now wrapping up a project by which we deployed optical fiber technology to the premise. And we only lack a few hundred customers. Well before the end of this year, we will have a fiber to the premise network that reaches every one of the customers within our service footprint. Base level of connectivity, symmetrical 100 meg service. And we have also deployed 10 gig architecture widely within that system. And if we needed more than that, you know, the network itself is capable of doing so. Now, you and I have talked ahead of time a little bit about something that you would like for me to share. And very candidly, if I contribute to these discussions, it is usually on this particular topic. I recognize, as my wife often points out to me, that it is not the most interesting line of discussion in this particular subject area, but I feel very strongly that it is essential to the discussion if we're to make meaningful progress. And that has to do with the reason why certain areas of our state are not reached by broadband. Now, I'm an old guy, and I'm an old telco guy on top of that. And so it is very important to me to make this point, because I believe very strongly that it is only in understanding why there is not broadband in some areas and why there is not a perfect similarity between broadband and electric or telephone or water or gas or sewer, why those differences exist. Candidly speaking, in this discussion, you will often hear some folks start calling out boogeymen. And with all due respect to the concerns that folks often legitimately express, I don't think that's helpful to the discussion. The reality is there is a reason why people do not serve portions of the state, and we need to focus on that reason, not the people that are not doing it, because that's very important. I can usually do this in about 60 to 90 seconds. I've done it enough, I even dream about it now. But the long and the short of it is we got telephone service to 98% of Americans. That only occurred, believe it or not, in the late 90s. We got telephone service to 98% of all American households, primarily because all the way back in the early 1930s, the United States government adopted a policy of universal service. In connection with an agreement reached with the Bell companies, or the American Telephone and Telegraph, in the early 1930s, later codified in the 1934 Telecommunications Act. We had a very clearly defined U.S. public policy that said we would share revenues among the entire public switch telephone network in such a way that companies could afford to build facilities into all areas of the United States of America and price those facilities at a level that could be afforded by all Americans. Concept was very simple. A network that could reach and could be reached by all was beneficial to the public policy of the United States, just like the interstate highway systems. And that policy was successful. We built arguably the nation or the world's most efficient telecom network. But you got to remember, we only accomplished that goal of about 98% penetration in the late 1990s, right before the advent of cellular technology began a displacement of traditional wireline telephones. Now, a lot of people firmly believe, and I happen to be among them, that broadband's importance to society today approaches that of electricity and the old telecom networks. And I certainly don't argue with that. But there are a couple of things that are very different than the electric market and the old telecom market. The first one is that the telecom network and the electric grid were all deployed in a pure natural monopoly setting. They were more precisely provided in the telecom sector as a regulated monopoly. And again, we had a take rate of about 98%. Electric models today are built on take rates approximating 100% as well, and are still largely regulated as well, except in states, for example, like Alabama, that don't regulate rural electric. And so that's a big difference, okay, in deploying a service into a true monopoly environment under regulation with public policy support. The other difference is a little more practical. Not only is broadband a competitive marketplace, we've got to understand, and by that what I mean is, while there is not broadband everywhere, there is, and there are, candidly speaking, there are some areas where there are no alternatives to wired broadband. There's no wireless coverage. Satellite would be the only thing that would be available. The reality is you've got a concept known as good enough. State-of-the-art fiber to the premise networks are clearly the future-proof game plan long-term. But the reality is, where those are not necessarily affordable, there is almost always some substitute that is, in many cases, good enough for the intended purpose. Not everybody has academic requirements. Not everybody has work from home requirements. Not everybody has gaming requirements. And there are substitute technologies, unlike that in, generally speaking, the electric market. Those two factors very quickly converge to render us in a marketplace where, quite simply, it is difficult to build a business case to deploy service absent, I say again, absent significant and substantial public policy funding support. So when you see an area of Alabama that is not being served by any particular carrier, focus on the reason why. The simple reality of it is there has been inadequate public policy support to engender an economically feasible business model. And with all due respect, it's not popular in some discussions today, but we still as a nation don't expect for-profit entities to go bankrupt merely for the public good. We still expect them to operate in a reasonable return perspective. So the discussion must focus on that principle and not the fact that somebody out there is just unwilling to do it because they're bad corporate citizens. And I say that because I am absolutely not beholden to any of the large carriers or anyone else in that case. So to the extent I can add to this discussion and help people understand that fundamental economic principle, I'm good.
Well, thank you, Fred. We talked yesterday about how this was a complex conversation, and I appreciate that you have borne that out. And I've jotted down some words that I've got to look up when we're done with this conversation to see what you mean about that. But thank you for setting up the groundwork for us. Maureen, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about some of the work that is happening at ADECA and trying to, I think, get at some of the issues that Fred shared with us?
Sure. Here at ADECA, we have kind of a three-pronged approach to addressing some of these issues.
And Maureen, I'm sorry, why don't you just take a minute to say what who ADECA is, what ADECA does at a broad level?
Sure. ADECA is the Alabama Department of Economic and Community Affairs, and we have several divisions. We run numerous programs, state and federal. We focus typically on grant programs, but we do some other types of activities here as well. I'm the division chief for the Energy Division, and in the Energy Division, we have the Office of Broadband Development, or as we call it, Broadband Alabama. And our focus has been on three different areas. The first area was established through the Alabama Broadband Accessibility Act, which created the Alabama Broadband Accessibility Fund. That fund started out in 2018 with about $7.4 million to extend broadband in unserved rural areas. In 2019, the legislature made some amendments to the program because we'd had some implementation obstacles that we needed to overcome in terms of definitions, what was actually served and unserved, and what parts of the state would be eligible for this funding. So in 2019, those amendments were made, and an additional appropriation was made for $20 million. And then we had a third appropriation for $20 million again this past fiscal, or this current fiscal year. Through this program, and there are some slides that I uploaded. I'm not going to go through all of those slides, but I did want to mention that so far we have awarded close to $20 million worth of grant funds, 19.8 million. And that has brought in a private sector investment of about $47 million. Those represent, once these projects are completed, roughly 25,000 new services that will be available at a cost of less than $800 in public funding per new service. So we feel like the program has been very successful for what it is. Obviously, $20 million, we are currently working with a consultant who has identified that to provide state-of-the-art fiber to the premises at every single residence and business in Alabama would be somewhere from $4 to $6 billion. So our $20 million is certainly a huge step in the right direction, but it's only one part of the solution. Some of the other things that we're looking at, in addition to the infrastructure program that we're running, the Alabama Broadband Accessibility Fund, we also were able to use some of the CARES Act money to fund the ABC for Students, or Alabama Broadband Connectivity for Students program. And this was an internet voucher program. Several things about this are very exciting. Hopefully there'll be a way to move forward with this in the future to do something similar. One of the big things, obviously, 207,000 students were given free internet service through this process. Now, some of them already had service and we were subsidizing or paying for what they already had. Some of them were new students added that didn't have it before. Some of them didn't have traditional broadband available to them, and we had to provide hotspots. But some unique things we were able to do with that program, because it was a state program, was that, first of all, we had 42 internet service providers who were part of this program, who participated with us. The overwhelming majority of those providers were Alabama providers. Certainly our national providers were part of the mix as well, but we were able to work with the smaller providers who are in some of those areas that are traditionally difficult to get service to, and give them an incentive to work with some parts of the state that, because we were going to be paying for the internet service for a period of time, they were able to do some things they might not have otherwise been able to do. Downside to this, obviously, is the long-term funding approach. Initially, the program was designed to end in December. We were able to extend the program through June of this year. Once the funding runs out, we're not sure what next steps are. The Federal Communication Commission has been awarded funding to do a similar type program at a national scale. Certainly theirs is a $50 contribution, whereas ours was pretty much the full bill. They'll be working with internet service providers who sign up for their program, and we don't know all the rules yet and the programs yet, but that information will be linked on our ABC for Students website. The third thing that we're, oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I was going to come back to you in just a minute and ask you to talk about mapping. I want to go to Jordan here in a moment, but I want to come back to you in just a minute and ask if you can tell us about some of the mapping efforts and how we actually know who was underserved and where those individuals happen to be. We know that's not always an easy topic.
Okay.
Jordan, you're joining us from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I think many of us know what the local chambers of commerce do. We may not be so familiar with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce or what the chamber's interests and initiatives are around this conversation.
Well, good morning. Once again, I'm here from Washington, D.C. And the U.S. Chamber of Commerce represents over 3 million businesses through direct membership and also through our local and state chambers, who are also members as well. We represent businesses of all sizes and sectors. And given the importance of broadband and connecting all those industries together with consumers, and also with helping with the talent pipeline for things like digital learning, broadband is a major priority for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Broadband effectively has kept the digital lights on for e-commerce, for businesses working from home, for remote working, for virtual classrooms. So it's critically important that broadband is deployed across the country and all Americans are connected. Even prior to the pandemic, the Chamber Technology Engagement Center, which I lead, released a report highlighting the benefits just even if all rural small businesses had access to digital tools. And we estimated that nationally it would be $47 billion in added GDP, and that would add over 300,000 jobs across the country. For Alabama, that actually translates to a projected $2.8 billion in sales, an additional 12,000 new jobs, and a little under $500 million in additional annual wages just for the state of Alabama. So even before the pandemic, broadband was important across the country in terms of putting forward economic growth. The pandemic has even further exacerbated the issues of the digital divide. For example, when we're looking at things like online learning, 1 in 4 teens with household income of $30,000 or less lack access to a computer. Only 44% of families nationwide making under $30,000 have in-home broadband connectivity. That's due to access issues and affordability issues. Only 18% of Hispanic students have access to a computer, and 11% of Black students, so it's an equity issue too. One of the things that's concerning the most is the homework gap we're seeing emerge as classrooms continue to be virtual and students who are in lower economic brackets don't have access to those digital tools and get left behind. The Boston Consulting Group actually put forward a study recently that said that if a long-term homework gap has the ability to lower GPAs for students by about half a point, cuts their salaries down by up to $2,000 annually, and actually could be a drain on US GDP by $22 to $33 billion. So that's a big number, and it's important that we make sure that all Americans are connected. In terms of the solutions we've approached Congress with and the FCC with on a federal level, we really think that this is an issue that needs to be addressed from 3 legs of a policy stool. The first, we need smart spending. That means funding needs to go to areas that are unserved first, because they're, as Fred mentioned, they're high cost in terms of being able to build out in those areas. And we want to make sure it goes to unserved areas first. And mapping is critical to that. I know that Maureen will get into the details on that, but Congress just appropriated at the end of last year $65 million to actually conduct federal broadband mapping at the FCC. So we need to know where broadband is before we can actually start spending money on it en masse. The other key component to spending is technology neutrality. We need to pick funding for the technologies that make the most sense in terms of getting fast speed out, as well as looking at things like geography and other elements. So it's not a one size fits all approach. For example, this could be fiber or wireline. The cable industry has contributed about $450 billion to the GDP. Could be wireless. The wireless industry, even in 2018, contributed $475 billion in GDP. But then there are other solutions out there as well. Companies like Google and Facebook and Microsoft are developing high altitude stations. They're looking at things like using TV white spaces to deploy broadband connectivity. And then finally, too, even in space, that's also another option as well. We know that Starlink, which is operated by SpaceX, is actually beginning to deploy low Earth orbit satellites that are actually getting a better satellite connectivity for broadband than we previously had in the past. So there are a lot of different routes we can take in terms of the type of service. Other things too, we want to make sure that there's speed to market in terms of making sure that we can deploy broadband to the areas that don't have it the quickest. And we think it's important too that Congress appropriate the funds to do this massive undertaking to fund high cost broadband. We want to make sure that we don't deplete the universal service program that exists in terms of where we view things. And then finally, too, on the permitting side and the regulatory side. Permitting, we think it's important that companies, when they're considering investing large sums of capital, can get a decision as to whether or not they can build equipment out. So we think things like shot clocks are a good idea on the state and local level. We encourage localities to try to tailor fees more along the lines of what it costs to apply and maintain equipment on public rights of way. And finally, we need a smart regulatory environment. And what we've noticed too is that we view broadband to be an essential service, but we view that when broadband is regulated like a public utility, you don't see the private investment that you typically would see if you allow it to operate more with a light touch regulatory framework. So those are a few issues that I think we feel are important, but looking forward to the rest of the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you all for that, helping us get a lay of the land. In just a minute, Maureen, I'm giving you a heads up, Maureen. I'm going to come back to you, talk about mapping. And also, I think you had a third element you wanted to share about ADECA, and I interrupted you, and forgive me for that. I'm going to come back to you about that, so don't forget. But first, I want to ask just the group to define for us a very complicated term, and that is served. What do we mean by served? And if I did the math right, Fred, I took about 60 years to get the entire country, or 98% of the country, served with a phone. Are we talking about 60 years to get broadband everywhere it needs to be? And as you're talking about the various projects of industry and government, how are you defining served? That's all of you, not just to Fred.
There are a number of ways to do it. The most predominant definition is the current FCC requirement for prospective federal universal service support, which means that there is a terrestrial provider currently offering service of at least 25.3 or better.
And by 25.3, you mean?
25.3, 25 megabits per second download and a 3 megabits per second upload. That's the minimum requirement prospectively. Now there are a few minutiae involved in that, but as a general principle, that is the prospective standard which you're required to meet for prospective universal service fund.
That's the same definition that is in the state's legislation for unserved. If that is not available in an area, it is considered unserved.
But and that generally is the, as we said before, as Fred said, the FCC uses that number. But at that number, though, just to give everyone a heads up, the FCC projects that there are 18 million Americans who lack access to that service, at least. But I think Maureen will probably get into it a little later, but the way that the maps are so woefully inadequate, that number is probably a little bit higher than that.
Before we go to maps, just remind me, 25 meg is the minimum definition. What is the sort of the general top of the line service that your average retail customer can buy if they live in the right place?
Well, this is a subject on which reasonable minds will clearly differ. 25.3 will accommodate most critical applications as long as an individual home doesn't overtax it. So no one in our industry effectively gets up and says 25.3 is anything close to a gold standard. But it is a standard by which many critical applications can be served. And it is also a threshold at which there is a huge leap when you start moving above that. And we can get into that in whatever level of detail. That depends upon whether it's a traditional copper-based network, an optical fiber-based network, a hybrid fiber coax-based network, such as a cable provider. All of that starts playing into what the next steps are. So now your question about typical. You know, the thing that is really sexy that gets a lot of people talking these days is gig service. Now, gig service is very popular among those who are either enamored by it or truly need it. Probably the most fundamental standard today has a 100 meg download and anywhere from 50 meg upload to 100 meg symmetrical upload. And that will depend a lot upon the type of technology. Most homes do well to tax under any condition a 100-100 service. A lot of folks love to have a gig because it's sexy and they like to say they've got it. Very few homes utilize anywhere near its capacity. And then of course you're beginning to hear people talk about 10 gig architecture, and that will come, as will 100 gig. But you know, that's a little bit esoteric at this point.
Maureen, let's talk about maps.
Okay. Mapping is difficult, and there are a lot of reasons for that. Right now, most states, including Alabama, use as their map the base of the Federal Communications Commission map. That map is kind of a hybrid of two previous maps. In the old days when broadband reporting went to different agency, we had two different types of reporting. We had urban and rural. Everything got mixed together as part of the urban reporting, which has to do with census blocks. And those census blocks, what basically internet service provider says, I can serve X number of houses, and they're shown based on their location in census boundaries. Those census boundaries in an urban area are oftentimes very small. And if you serve a handful of structures in that census boundary in an urban area, it's quite likely you do serve the entire, or somebody serves the entire census boundary. But as you get out into the more rural areas, those census boundaries for a census block are much larger, and they can encompass most of a county. And to cover one or two houses in a census block that is a quarter of a county is in no way indicating that that entire county or portion of a county is served. Yet our maps indicate that that entire census boundary is served. And so oftentimes the numbers that are given in terms of who has service and who doesn't, those numbers of served individuals are highly inflated because a portion of the census boundary that's being reported is served, but some or most of that boundary may not be served. And so that's our base where we start from, is a map that is just, it's not accurate. Everyone knows it's not accurate. And so as was mentioned, there is funding and a mandate for this map at the national level to be improved. We've been involved in a lot of those conversations. They're still working just like everyone else to try and figure out how to make that type of map work. There's voluntary reporting. As we have mentioned, it's a not very regulated field. And so what is reported and how it's reported is varied among entities. And so that's something that has to be standardized. And then the other thing is what level do we want? Here in Alabama, we're getting ready to start a address level mapping for state broadband. And we hope that at that granular level, we'll have the best data out there that we can have. We have great partnerships with many of the internet service providers. So we feel like we're gonna get good data to begin with, something that the federal level map may or may not be able to get that same kind of cooperation. The other thing is we're not sure that they're looking at address level. They may not be looking at the census blocks like they are now, and they're looking more, I think, at some kind of, I don't know if it'll be points or GPS points or how they're looking at it, but they're going to be looking at the states to provide base maps. And so Alabama is going to go ahead and get started on this and have the most granular level of data that we can have, so that whatever the feds end up doing, our information will be as accurate as possible. We're also building into this annual update, so that as new projects are built out, either federally funded, state funded, or just private investment, how it normally happens, we can update the map and show who is served. We're also hoping to show what level of service is available. As Fred mentioned, some places they have 25.3, but barely. Some have less than that. Some have nothing. There are all kinds of different technologies out there as well that we would hope to be able to identify, so that we can determine who really has good access and who has infrastructure issues that prevent them from having access.
Thank you, Maureen. Jordan, it seems to me that these conversations, generally speaking, create a lot of strange bedfellows, and sometimes strange, whatever the opposite of that is, strange conversations. I'm thinking about that with you in particular, with the chamber, and that I presume that you represent some industries and companies that are providing broadband, as well as some that don't have it and are unhappy with the service they have, and that may put attention on the work that you do in the chamber. Correct me if I'm wrong there, of course. I'm curious as to what you would say to business leaders in Alabama as to what they can do individually, cooperatively, to advance these conversations, so that their needs are served, their workforce demands are being met, and that their interest in addressing those education gaps that you shared with us terrifyingly a few minutes ago, we can do what we can as a community to close those gaps.
Well, I think one of the first things that businesses, especially in Alabama, can do is really push on their elected officials here in Washington, to push for broadband for high cost areas where, there's effectively some form of a market failure because the cost is just too high to deploy. I think that's critical. The other issue too is I think, public-private partnerships are something that must be embraced. For example, we've seen some good programs. I know Alabama's doing some good work, but I've seen some other good programs in states like Virginia too that have, like the VATI program, which have attempted to link up, smaller providers along with some of the large providers and local government to provide funding on that level as well. They use, I think actually it was tobacco settlement fund money to actually fund broadband. There are good public-private partnerships out there that I think are available. And then, I think the business community really needs to work together also, with its own solutions too. For example, the broadband providers, for the most part during 2020, enabled consumers to stay connected despite, their inability to pay during the pandemic. They're also doing a lot of great work. I know Comcast, for example, is doing great work with inner city communities with its Internet Essentials program, for example, and cities like Chicago helping deploy digital tools to communities that have affordability issues. I think everyone has a role to play. The private sector has a role to play in advancing digital equity. At the same time, government has a role where there's a market failure out there, and when it can fill in the gaps there, we think it should do so.
Along those lines, and to everyone, I've heard it said several times over the last couple of months, and may have been heard to say it myself, is that what we in the country need, is a broadband equivalent of the rural electrification project. What do you respond to that?
Who was that directed to?
To anyone and everyone.
I'll tackle that. My career goes back almost 39 years in both rural electrification and rural telecommunications. There's no question. The things that you've heard Jordan elaborate are right on point. I kept listening for any particular area that I might disagree with him on. I don't think I found one. But you could accomplish a lot if we lived in a political environment where the President of the United States and probably about 4 committee chairmen, the Secretary of Agriculture and the Secretary of Commerce could be called into a room and given some very clear marching orders about what to do. This is not really a partisan issue. And a coordinated strategy that provides adequate support for private industry to get the job done would work. It just takes an allocation of resources and a prioritization of those resources. Now, I have to believe the private sector can do that far more efficiently than government can, just like they did in rural electrification and rural telecommunications. But there's no question it can be done. I need to add one sentence though, and this is very important to this discussion. It's not just about extending broadband into rural areas or high-cost areas. You have got to address for the adequate adoption of broadband statewide to actually accomplish what we would all agree with as our prime objective. You've also got to address the affordability issue of broadband by all. There are plenty of inner city people that have just as much trouble affording a $65 a month broadband connection, regardless of the technology, as there are rural Alabamians that have trouble affording that. So the question of affordability must also be addressed as well.
And I'll take that question as well. I think I want to address both the access and the affordability issue too. And I think in terms of how this needs to be approached, the private sector needs to be the leader in making sure Americans are connected. It's because of private sector investment and somewhat light touch federal regulation that we've been able to build out the most technologically advanced broadband networks in the world. There's a reason why in Europe, for example, certain providers were asking certain edge providers and websites to slow down their traffic during the height of the pandemic. We didn't see that in the US. And I think it's important we maintain a vibrant, healthy, leading private sector in which funding needs to go to areas that are unserved. Now, at the same time, and funding, I mean, from federal authorities and state authorities. Now, when it comes to the adoption issue, Fred, I couldn't agree more. I think that's an issue that our urban areas are experiencing, especially right now during the pandemic. And I think obviously this has provided another opportunity where we need to take a look at how can we modernize things like the Federal Lifeline program to make that more efficient. Congress just recently passed in the Consolidated Appropriation Act a $3.2 billion emergency broadband benefit. The FCC just released a report on that and an order implementing that just this week. And that basically would provide eligible households with $50 off their broadband coverage that's reimbursable to eligible communications carriers in the program. That's $75 in tribal areas, and then up to $100 extra in a connected device as well too. So we need targeted, temporary, and timely relief to help us during the COVID-19 pandemic with regard to affordability. But we also need to recognize that there is a long-term interest in making sure we reform and modernize the permanent systems already in place, such as Lifeline.
I'd be curious, and this may come back to you, Fred, or anyone, although Maureen may be in a position to see this uniquely. You addressed the concept of good enough early in our conversation, Fred, and I wonder if, yesterday it was stated that were it not for broadband right now, in spite of all of our challenges, were it not for broadband, that we would right now be in a Great Depression, given the effects of the pandemic. I'm wondering if good enough today is the same as good enough, pre-pandemic, now that our home is our school, is our office for so many people.
I think for a substantial portion of the population, what was good enough a year ago never will be again. No question about that. Now, that concept is still legitimate enough to affect the economics of deployment, but in terms of what our true needs are, I could easily demonstrate that just by the percentage of our customer base that will now permanently work from home, and we have to certify the connectivity abilities of their home for their employer to allow them to do that. So it will never change back.
And Maureen, let me quickly point out that Maureen referenced some documents that she has shared, and if you are with us on the Whova app, there should be a link beneath our video screen or to your left labeled documents, and you can see some of the maps that Maureen referenced and some slides she shared with all of us, and they'll be there all week. Maureen, I seem to recall there were some early concerns about the adoption of the adoption rates of the ABC program are not what we'd hoped they would be. Where does that stand now? And is there still room for more families to enroll that program in that program?
Unfortunately, the funding only allowed us to extend the benefits to people who were already enrolled in the program. We were not able to add any new families, but we had roughly 207,000 children who low-income children who received service through that program. So we feel like it was incredibly successful for what it was.
Ryan, can I give a quick shout out about mapping in Alabama?
Yes, please.
Maureen is a very humble person, but the reality of it is I'm a big fan of ADECA and the work she and Director Boswell have done over there. I have a lot of exposure to what's going on nationwide in that regard. And the candid truth is that the Alabama Department of Economic and Community Affairs is on the cusp of deploying one of the leading true mapping solutions to know how to properly plan for broadband in the United States. And they are to be commended for the foresight and vision they had to pull that off. It's nation leading.
Well, I will echo that. I've spoken to a lot of folks in preparation for this event, some on our agenda this week, many who are not. And many of them have expressed excitement, anticipation, and eagerness. So don't let us keep you from that task today, Maureen, but eagerness to see those maps when they come online. I think we've got about 2 minutes left. I've been asking you some questions that have come across my screen, but I want to see if there's anything else that three of you want to share or ask one another, or parting words to leave us with as we think about this conversation and go into tomorrow's meeting.
I just want to very briefly say that, and thank you, Fred, very much. We have had some incredible partners in this state. We often get slammed as being the worst in so many categories. But we are making such strides, and we have a long way to go. But with our accessibility program, our infrastructure program, we are funding at a level that most states are not funding at. So that's something to be proud of. Our ABC for Students was the first of its kind to deal with a statewide program rather than an isolated program, and also to deal with 42 ISPs involved in this program that we were able to reach as many as we were. And as Fred mentioned, our mapping program is incredibly ambitious, what we're hoping to do with our statewide planning and our mapping initiatives. So we have a long way to go, but we have made some great first steps and are making big steps toward addressing some of these issues. And we are so proud of the partnerships that we have formed to do this, because it's not a single entity answer. It's going to take the private sector, it's going to take state and federal government, and it's going to take local communities. So we're just excited about the future.
Ryan, my closing comments would be this. Keep in mind that a lot of good people truly believe that connecting Alabama is every bit as important as it is, and as most folks would like for it to be. The Alabama-based independents that I'm associated with have already invested close to, well over $250 million in optical fiber networks. And Alabama's ISPs will step up to this challenge. Keep encouraging your local legislators or your local legislators to help in that area. And as Jordan said, keep encouraging your federal congressional delegations to support timely and well-intentioned federal programs to make it happen.
And, I'll close with, there are very few issues that I deal with in tech policy that I can talk to legislators in Alabama and West Virginia and have them say the same things as in Washington State and New York, and that we need to make sure we connect all Americans now. And this is the time to do it, and in a smart way. I'll make a shameless self plug. We do have some of our ideas at americaninnovators.com/tech-upgrade. To highlight how we view America should be connected, but this is one in which the private sector and the public sector both need to work together to solve this problem.
Thank you, everybody. I'm jumping back in now, Larkin Martin, because our time is just about up. And I want to say thank you to Ryan and Parka for organizing this session for us. We had a great one yesterday. We look forward to another one tomorrow. Thank you particularly today to Jordan, Fred, and Maureen. You've emphasized for us with really good and candid information on the interrelated challenges I mentioned in the beginning. First, technically serving difficult to serve areas, and then empowering through affordability and technical training the usage of this technology that's become so important for life today. COVID accelerated its importance. We've got a interrelated regulatory, from a layman's point of view, difficult to navigate and understand world that we're going to have to solve for businesses and households to move forward in a digital age. And this broadband connectivity issue, we all know is crucial. So thank you. Thanks to Parka for addressing the issue this week. We look forward to more tomorrow. Hope you all be able to tune in again. And I think that closes it for today.